Welcome to part 8 of Enlightenment in a Revolutionary World. Now we're going to talk about the radicalization of the French Revolution. Louis XVI's refusal, or at least failure to become a constitutional monarch, led to a revolution that ultimately is going to turn violent and radical. They are going to attempt to purge counter-revolutionaries. They're going to institute a reign of terror. Ultimately, they will, which we'll talk about later, execute the king himself, right? And turn the war literally into a war against all monarchs, right? They'll be attacked on all sides by the crown's heads of Europe, and the French people will rally around a new concept, nationalism, right? Having stopped the allies at the French border, the royal allies, the French will set about by trying to solve their internal problems that ultimately is going to lead to the rise of Napoleon Bonaparte. The French had attempted to demolish the Ancien regime without eradicating the monarchy or the church, right, or those other long-standing institutions, but resistance to the revolution by the kings caused, and the aristocrats and the clergy caused, that entire system to fall under attack when the revolution became completely radicalized. By 1792, the situation was really dire. Having failed in his attempt at counter-revolution and his attempt to flee France, the king had become virtually a prisoner of the Constitution of 1791. And France was beset by enemies on all sides. You had and had issues internally as well. The royal army internally was factionalized and very unreliable. The state itself was still laboring under a tremendous amount of long-term debt. Many clergy had rallied against the revolutions and called upon their congregations to join the counter-revolutionaries, right? On August 10th, 1792, the revolution starts to take a very radical turn. A mob of ordinary citizens stormed Tuileries and demanded a republic, and they killed 600 of the Swiss guards there at Tuileries. The Paris Commune, which was an elected body appointed by Minister of Justice Georges-Jacques Danton, is going to create a special court to try enemies of the revolution. But many Parisians are going to find this is not enough. Radicalized Paris workers are going to begin storming the jails, right, in the first weeks of early September, and murdering and injuring enemies of France. They're going to kill nearly 1,000 of these enemies, okay? The legislature created by the Constitution is going to react to this by suspending the army and creating a national convention entrusted with drafting a new Republican-style constitution. But inside of this national convention were two predominant and a third minor factions. First, you had the Girondins, right? The Girondins were moderates. They wanted to still work with the king, right? Trying to still kind of retain some of the old system. On the other side were radicals, Jacobins, right? The Jacobins were urged on by the sans-culottes and led by a radical named Maximilien Robespierre, right? He wanted to push the revolution to a more radicalized level. And then you had a third minor one called La Plaine, which was called that because it kind of existed between these two extremes in the convention. The state of national emergency created some pretty radical solutions. On the 21st of September 1792, the National Convention declared France a republic and began to draw a new republican constitution. The convention then established a committee of public safety, which was soon dominated by Robespierre and the Jacobins, right? And it gave it responsibility for running France. At least for now, the Jacobins are going to dominate, okay? To deal with France's dire war situation, it created what was called a levée en masse, right? A vast national army conscripted from all adult male citizens, okay? So the Committee of Public Safety reforms the army, installed a system of promotion based on merit, but they did purge any officers of aristocratic background, even if they supported the revolution, right? No aristocracy in the upper ranks. The levée en masse opposed by the smaller but professional armies of Europe they begin pushing these enemies back. This is that army that pushes the European powers back to the border in the fall of 1793. But then they don't stop. In the summer of 1794, the Levy en Masse begins to drive the Austrian forces out of Austrian Netherlands. This is modern-day Belgium, right? So what had become a defensive war of liberation to save France and preserve the revolution had become an offensive war to spread the revolution beyond the French borders. Meanwhile, back home, the Jacobins sought to create a perfect egalitarian society, right? Even if it meant infringing on some personal liberties. For example, they established free compulsory public education for all boys and girls. They established the right to public welfare for the poor. They imposed very strict price controls, especially on bread. But they also abolished the right of workers to form associations and to unionize and to strike. They abolished such titles as Monsieur and Madame in favor of the word citizen, right? They established a new calendar dating from the Revolution, of course the Revolution being year zero. They intended to replace the superstition of organized Christianity with a cult of reason. They confiscated the church nobles' lands and redistributed them to the poor, and they even replaced the old royal measurement systems with the metric system. With the Jacobins and the Radicals in control of the Committee of Public Safety, they completely radicalized the revolution. They began to eliminate any threats to their power by trials and executions, right? For example, the king was placed on trial. He was charged with tyranny and conspiracy against the Constitution. He was put on trial in December of 1792. He was executed in January of 1793. The vote to execute him won by only a single vote. In September of 1793, the National Convention, actually approved the Reign of Terror, right? And the Committee of Public Safety began eliminating a lot of people through these different little show trials, right? Victims included, at first, royalist noblemen, but then anybody of noble birth, and then clergy and other conspirators who were against the revolution, and then finally bourgeoisie and peasants who just simply expressed unpopular opinions. And then finally, it got down to the point that anyone who opposed the Jacobins and Robespierre, overall, you're going to have about 250,000 people arrested in France, 17,000 will be tried and executed, and 12,000 of those 17,000 will be killed by guillotine without trial, right? And untold thousands will die in jail, including the son of King Louis XVI, Louis XVII. The Reign of Terror will finally come to an end with the Thermidorian reaction of July of 1794. This was a group of Jacobins who had actually become so fearful that they were next that they actually levied charges against Robespierre himself, and Robespierre will become one of the last victims of the Reign of Terror, which he helped institute. After the fall of Robespierre and the Jacobins, the National Convention broke the radicals, the sans-culottes, right? And just like with the English Civil War, you're going to see the French Revolution take a step back, become more moderate, maybe even conservative. The next constitution they wrote up would not be completed until 1795, and it's going to create something that's called the Directory, right? The structure of this new constitution is going to be a step back from democracy. They decided, oh, we went a little bit too far with that. It's going to create an executive consisting of a 5-man board of directors, right, that will be selected by the legislature. The legislature will be bicameral. It'll have 2 houses. You'll have the Conseil des Anciens, right, the Council of Ancients, and you'll have the Conseil des 500, right, or the Council of 500. Okay. Kind of an upper and lower house, right? The members of the legislatures, again, are elected by the property owners, the 30,000 wealthiest male citizens in France, right? And the Directory from its very onset is going to be very unpopular. It was criticized by politicians on both sides of the political spectrum. Many of the directors were found to be corrupt, right? And many of the directors would, and the director itself would pursue aggressive military policies that were designed to distract the populace from their corruption and the depressed economy. And it's because of this structure that it's going to create the perfect environment for the rise of Napoleon.